Okay, I got the microphone. We're trying. I don't know how much the microphone is going to improve audio quality. I hope that it will. Um, I am weird, like I have weird hangups about improving my recording setup in any way, because in my mind, these videos aren't content creation. They're just me sitting and having a one-sided conversation with my camera. And while I acknowledge that this may not be objective reality, I have a sense that doing anything to improve my video quality, either by getting a microphone or, by doing any kind of video editing, anything like that, to me it feels like it cheapens it, which is irrational. But anyway, there we go. Hopefully you can hear me, because the number one comment that I got on my homophobia video was, "We can't hear you." And, it's unfortunate when you spend half an hour talking to a camera and no one can hear you talk. So, um, hi YouTube. My name is Jack, and today we're gonna talk more about what gods are and how they work and how big gods are. This is a subject that came up earlier this year. I had a conversation with a book club that was run by my friend Corvus, that was reading Queen of All Witcheries. And so they read the book, and then I had a conversation with them, and we did a Q&A session, and we talked through just a lot of the things that come up in the book. It was a really fun conversation. And one of the things that came up is that there's sort of a tension, particularly in a Wiccan context. There's sort of a tension between the idea of the goddess, or the Wiccan gods in general, but because this was a goddess book, that's what we were talking about, between the idea of the goddess as a localized tribal deity versus the goddess as a universal mother goddess, mother of all living type of figure. And it's an interesting question. It's one that plagues me. It's one that I don't have good answers to, but I want to just sit in the tension for a while. So that's what we're going to do in this video. So in Queen of All Witcheries, I point out kind of a historical trend in the development of goddess theology, or theology is a word that you'll sometimes hear people use. There was the development of the idea of a universal great goddess, the mother goddess, Mother Earth, who is associated with, the nighttime and the fertile soil and the moon and honoring the spirits of the dead. This is a figure that appears around the mid-19th century. There's a little bit of precedent for her elsewhere, but she doesn't really concretize in the collective consciousness until the 19th century. And she is understood to be a universal goddess, right? Part of the hypothesis that you get with people like Bachofen or James Frazer is that this goddess is kind of a fundamental stage in the development of human religion, that every religion somewhere, has a version of her. And that is, interestingly, in pretty stark contrast to the way that Gerald Gardner talks about the Wiccan gods in one of his books. I think it's The Meaning of Witchcraft. I haven't bothered to look up the exact quote in preparation for this video. But we're going to say it's The Meaning of Witchcraft, Gardner talks about the gods of the Wicca as small gods. And he suggests that these were relatively minor Celtic deities in the British Isles who became the patron deities of the witch cult and sort of got incorporated in as small tribal deities who were really affiliated only with this one tiny little branch fringe thing, and who were not significant deities in world mythology, nor even in the Celtic pantheon. You know how I feel about the idea that Wicca is Celtic, but it's a thing that by the time Gardner wrote The Meaning of Witchcraft, he was thinking that Wicca had its roots in the indigenous Celtic religions of the British Isles. That's an idea we don't see as much in witchcraft today, which is why I think that this quote is probably from The Meaning of Witchcraft. But regardless, his theology and his ideas about history changed over time. The point is that Gardner seems to have thought that these deities were relatively minor and honestly kind of insignificant. So far from being universal great gods, these are just small gods who were kind of, ignored by the pantheons of the world and happened to be worshipped by this one fringe religion. And there's a tension there, because you hear people talk about the gods of the Wicca in both senses. You hear people refer to the great goddess, the mother goddess, with an expectation that, that's something we can all access. She is referred to often as, the mother of all living. And the point here is, she's there for everyone, right? She is everyone's mother, and everyone has a right to worship the goddess. That is an important thing. But simultaneously, especially in the US, right, the cultures of initiatory Wicca are a little different from the US to Europe and some other parts of the world. But especially in the US, Gardnerian Wicca is thought of as a priesthood of two particular deities who are the patron deities of this religion. And they're understood to be kind of specific to us. So there's that tension. There is that tension between universal gods, anyone can worship them, they represent mysteries that all of us have access to, and then simultaneously patron deities of something that is closed off, that is behind initiatory doors, that in some sense, I don't want to say it's proprietary, but that in some sense, these are the deities of this thing, and not necessarily the deities that you're going to encounter outside of an initiatory Wiccan context. So there's a tug of war between those two different ways of thinking about who these deities are. And that's interesting. I like tension. I like things that feel like they're at odds with each other, because they make me think, and I like being made to think. And the thing that I said when I was having this conversation in the book club is that I think there is an element of universality about the gods, and then there's an element, by necessity, there's an element of locality as well. And the universality is, I've talked about this before, to me, what it is to be a god is to be fundamentally connected to a mystery, to an experience that is life-altering, that prompts us to worship. So my loose definition of a mystery, which is flawed for all kinds of reasons, but the working definition that I have, until I come up with a better one, is that a mystery is something that can only be understood by experiencing it, and that once experienced, changes you forever. So mysteries include things like birth, death, puberty, love of various kinds, depending on what you want to talk about. There are also things that fall under that definition that we wouldn't necessarily class as religious mysteries. So trauma of various kinds, right, meets that definition. And that opens up a whole can of worms as to whether whether and to what extent traumatic experiences can overlap with religious experiences. I don't want to stake a flag on that turf, because I don't know, right? There are gods of traumatic and upsetting things. There are gods of war, right? But that doesn't feel the same as the kinds of religious experiences that we talk about when we think about religious awe or feelings of religious wonder. And I think that most of us are not inclined to think of traumatic experiences as things that drive us to worship. So that's messy, that's complicated. But to me, to be a god is to be the embodiment, the personality, to be the thing that is behind that kind of mystery. So to be a god is to be a transformative experience, essentially. That is a very idiosyncratic personal theology, right? That is my understanding of who and what the gods are. That comes from my perspective as a member of an initiatory mystery cult. So people who belong to more exoteric religious traditions probably aren't going to go in for the whole like mystery and ecstatic experience thing. Also, just like historically, it's not necessarily reflective of the way that ancient pagans thought about their deities. Maybe in some contexts, right? Like maybe in the context of certain mystery cults. But also there's a lot of evidence that shows that like ancient pagans just kind of thought of the gods as people who happened to be more powerful than us and who were immortal. So like, I'm not saying that this is a universal theology. This is just how I think about gods. And I think about gods as, yeah, like the thing that is behind ecstatic mystery experiences that transform us and drive us to worship. When we experience something that overwhelms us and changes us essentially, if we are driven to worship that, the God is what we are worshiping. And that is, I think, in its essence, that is something universal. Because anyone who experiences those mysteries and feels driven to worship whatever worship is, which, like, oh, that's a complicated question. But if you are driven to want to seek, to venerate, to honor, to experience connection with the thing that is behind that experience, then so long as you've had that experience, of course you can. That's accessible to anyone who has the experience. Now, as I've defined mystery, it's not accessible to anyone who hasn't had that experience. And so, for example, there are all kinds of mysteries that I will never have access to, and therefore all kinds of gods, or at least sort of facets of gods, that I will never be able to properly worship. One example is, right, menstruation. Menstruation is something that you don't understand until you've experienced it. Once you have experienced it, it changes you forever. And then, repeatedly for several decades of your life. I don't menstruate. I never have menstruated. I never will menstruate. And there are a lot of people for whom their understanding of the goddess, the great universal goddess that we're talking about here, there are a lot of people for whom their understanding of that goddess is intimately connected with the experience and the mystery of menstruation. I have never had that experience. That experience is not a part of how I understand the goddess, and that's just like, that is a mystery that is closed off to me. That's okay, right? There are things that aren't accessible to me. There are things that are going to be meaningful to other people that I'll never be able to experience. That's just kind of part of it. But I think for the most part, with a lot of mysteries, with a lot of like the big ones, the experience of being born, the experience of going through puberty, regardless of how exactly that changes your body, growing older, the experience of like the first time that you experience a death in the family and you have to confront grief. These are things that everyone has access to, and these are potentially transformative experiences that can become the basis of religious veneration. And so I think that when we talk about the gods as mysteries, which is how I understand them, though not a universal theology, that's going to be accessible to everyone. And so when we think about the Wiccan gods, who, if we want to get really reductive with it, the Wiccan gods are life and death. And like the core mystery of Wicca, I'm giving everything away here. What Wicca is all about, again, if we're being super, super reductive and really oversimplifying everything. There is a goddess of life, there is a god of death, and life and death are in love with each other. And life gives way to death, and death gives way to life, and that's fucking magical, and that's what Wicca's about. There's more going on, right? That is a gross oversimplification, but if you really wanted to be reductive, that's kind of what it gets to. And those gods, life and death, like those are universal things. And so, of course, anyone can worship them and anyone can access them. At the same time, I think there is also a necessary element of particularism and locality to not just the Wiccan gods, but to any gods. Because I really detest the theology that says we make up the gods and they exist because we believe in them. I think it is lazy. I think it is deeply theologically unfounded. I think it ignores the reality that we worship the things that exist around us and that they wouldn't exist, like they wouldn't be worth worshiping if they weren't bigger than us, right? Things like, right, the example that I give in the video where I talk about whether we create the gods is Aphrodite. And there's a sense in which Aphrodite is love. Right? She's not just the goddess of love, she is love. And the thing is, like, love would be around whether we decided that there was a goddess of love or not. Love would be around whether we worshipped it or not. We start worshiping love because it is there and it is worthy of our worship. And I think that's a really important distinction. Now, that said, there is this weird sort of feedback loop where the essence of the gods predates us, but at the same time, the ways in which we know them, the ways in which we access whatever their mysteries are, those ways are necessarily going to depend on us and on who we are and how we understand and interact with them. So the stories that we tell about the gods, the names that we put to them, like those are things that do come from us. And there is something behind all of that that is bigger than us, that is worthy of our worship, and that's what kicks it all off. But at the same time, there's something very particular and very culturally dependent about the specific like names and faces and stories and mythology that we build up around particular deities. And that does kind of come from us. So there's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. And I think that when we think about like the particularism of Wicca, the sense in which the gods of the Wicca are small gods, that's what it is, right? We have, like, again, if we're being grossly simplistic, we have a goddess of life and we have a god of death. The mere fact that those two deities have particular genders, that she is a goddess and he is a god, that is something that is kind of culturally dependent and is not universal. So elsewhere in world mythology, you might find death goddesses and male gods who are associated with, fecundity and life and so on. The fact that she is associated like so specifically with the moon and the tides and the earth, and like those are specific, concrete, particular things about her that come out of a specific cultural context. And that matters. Elsewhere in the world, you're going to find deities who are associated with life and vitality and birth and whatever else, but they're not all going to be moon deities. They're not all going to be earth deities. Like that is something that is specific to this goddess as we understand her. And then there's even more specific stuff that's like within the context of initiatory Wicca. And likewise with gods of death, right? Like, so what I'm trying to drive at is that in every deity, there is something universal. There is something that anyone who has this experience is able to access and able to worship. And also there is something so incredibly particular and historically dependent. Both of those things have to exist at the same time. And I think that is true not only of the gods of the Wicca, but also of any deity anywhere at any time. So, like Aphrodite again is an easy example, because there is this thing that is love, understood very broadly, right? We can be talking about sexual love or romantic love or all of the loves. And that exists. That's just like, that's a universal thing that's out there, and anyone who has ever experienced love is able to access that and is therefore able to worship the essence of who and what Aphrodite is. But to call her Aphrodite, to understand her as the wife of Hephaestus, to understand her as the lover of Ares, to understand her as being born from the sea, right? Though, like, to understand her in the context of like her worship at the cult centers of Paphos and Byblos, and the way that that overlapped with the worship of, Astarte or Ishtar, and like to put her in that really particular personality so that when you call the name Aphrodite, you're not just saying love, but you are interacting with a specific personified deity. That is particular. The universal and the particular exist at the same time, and they have to coexist. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up here. I hope the microphone is still on. I worry that it may have turned itself off. Oh, no, there's still a light going. Anyways, it is past my bedtime. I am going to end this here. I hope you can hear me. Good night, and I'll talk to you soon.